Grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as we have gathered in the midst of His Spirit here this morning. Had a fun encounter yesterday. There were two people who were meeting each other for the first time. And so person one says to person two, "So, where are you from?" And person two says, "Saxton." And person one says, "Where?" Person two, "Saxton." Person one, "Is that in Missouri?" And person two says, "Yeah, right near Cape Girardeau." Person one, "Oh, Sykeston." Person two, "Yeah, Saxton." Communication sometimes can be difficult, even when we're purportedly speaking the same language. But that was a significant issue for these folks 2,000 years ago when they wanted to share the news of Jesus in a new way. Because you had these folks, it was the day of Pentecost, but they were really, by and large, between the period of Jesus rising from the dead and when he ascended back into heaven, a short period of time. Now that has just passed. And they really kind of seem to often hunker down in the safety of some house. And that also then says to us very clearly that, as it is even purported there in actual numbers in the Bible, that there were very few people following Jesus at this point. And that's a real conundrum when you say, here it was that Jesus rises from the dead, and somehow that didn't even get the attention of very many people. But that all changes on this particular Pentecost day, when the moving of God's Spirit will end up ultimately with 3,000 people saying that they want to be added to the list of those who follow Jesus. So you have these people who had come together, I don't know, maybe in celebration of Pentecost, but it really doesn't seem that they're doing anything special. It doesn't seem that they've somehow prayed uniquely. It doesn't indicate that they're doing anything out of the ordinary. But all of a sudden, God shows up in this powerful, miraculous way, in this tongues of fire and wind and all of this. And the whole wind, flame, and spirit that was a part of this journey of inspiring them to something new. And one thing that can get a bit lost on us then, I think, and it really doesn't mention it per se, is that if they were in the house, but then somehow then the conversation begins to happen evidently outside the house. All these people, all the crowd, as it's indicated, can't be getting inside the house. So there was something about this moving of the Spirit that ultimately sent these folks out into the world. And that's a real key piece. Maybe some of you are aware of a guy by the name of John Ortberg. He's a contemporary writer. And he wrote one book that was entitled, "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat." And it's a reference to Peter, one of the disciples, who one day saw Jesus coming across, walking on water. It was a terrible, stormy day, and Jesus calms it all, and he's just walking there as if he was on solid ground. Peter, in his inimitable way, just jumps out of the boat, says, "If Jesus can do it, well, why not me?" And for a moment that faith sustains him, but then fear creeps in and he starts to sink. He says, "Jesus, help me," and Jesus does. And throughout the eons ever since, Peter is often referenced as one who didn't have enough faith to walk on water, and that's legitimate. But when I think about this event, I always come back to, well, what about the other 11 that were safe back there in a boat? You know, and these were fishermen, kind of hard, ruddy characters that probably in the old boys club kind of a manner let Peter know, gave him some ribbing about not having enough faith and things like that. I'm absolutely convinced that Peter heard about it and that it wasn't necessarily genteel. So you got the question. When I'm living out my life, and there is the fray out there somehow, and it's risky, it's threatening. If I jump out of whatever my safe environment is, and take a risk for Jesus, I may start sinking, so to speak. I probably will not be able to fully be in concerted, focused faith. So should I do that? And risk all of that torment of people who will mock me and make fun of me? Or do I remain with the 11/12 of us that just reside safely and secure in whatever boat of life we have? And so for me, that really is the kind of issue that is always before us, particularly in our time, in our culture, that God calls us to go step out of the boat. We all want to see God's Spirit move in a way that he kind of does with this Pentecost. I mean, isn't that really cool that God's Spirit comes and they can miraculously do something that they couldn't do before? Why not me? Why not now? Well, okay. But it was in that context where they were prepared, they were ready to move out into the world somehow. Lots of times, people, particularly those who aren't particularly well versed in the speaking of tongues, consider this event that. But it really isn't. Speaking in the tongues is a prayer kind of language that people really do not internalize as a language spoken on earth. This is totally different. This is, Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan community. There were people from all over the world as it existed at that time that came for commerce, for spiritual pilgrimage, whatever it might be that led them to be there at this point in time. People that spoke all sorts of different languages. Most of them really, at this point, Jews. And so you had this problem of how are you going to share this Jesus story when you have a communication issue. And so it's fascinating that God shows up, and so these people all of a sudden can speak languages they never were able to speak before. That seems to be a significant kind of spiritual miracle. That should really get anyone's attention. That should make you go, wow, what's going on here? You should celebrate. But humans are people, and we often seem to criticize, be scared of that which we do not understand, including if it is something that comes pointedly from God. And so some of them say, they're just drunk with new wine. Now, I first of all think that that's really interesting, that if you hear someone speaking a language that they've never spoken before, and this was an instantaneous change in their life, that you would think that they're drunk would be a more logical explanation than somehow a spiritual miracle. But so it is as humans work. Okay. And so to put yourself in that context, you're one of the 12, not the least of which, why don't you be Peter, the one who just always steps out of the boat, so to speak. And this is a life-transforming moment as well as Peter takes the reins. What are you going to do? Well, the knee-jerk reaction for any of us is to get defensive. And in a way he does, but he really doesn't. If you say, well, you're just drunk, you go, no, I'm not. And then you get this little tete-a-tete back and forth. And, the more you doth protest, the more people kind of go, yeah, who knows, It's a he said, she said kind of a thing, whatever. There he goes, if it was the afternoon, we might be drunk. But it's only early in the morning. Nobody's drunk in the morning. So that can't be the answer. I consider that to be the funniest verse in the Bible. And that sometimes well-meaning people can take the Bible and put too much serious religiosity on it. This was intended to be hilarious. And I think in the context, there were a lot of chuckles, and it brought down that negative tension that was set up. So it's something we should really notice, that we have some direction as to whenever you feel threatened for your faith, whenever you've stepped out of your boat of life and taken a risk for Jesus, and recognize that you're going to get some folks who are going to speak back at you. Well, you can use some humor. Don't get defensive. And so after the chuckling subsides, Peter goes, well, if people are going to attack me, then I might as well preach them a sermon. Always a good idea. And so he does. Now, through the eons, this sermon, kind of the first one recorded about Jesus, doesn't really rise to any particularly significant praise of oratory. Basically, the facts about who Jesus is and that promise. And so, to give people that understanding in very simple language, a fairly short sermon of why following Jesus is a better idea. And so again, since he had lowered the tension, engaged them through some humor, they listen. And he says, with following Jesus, young people who lack experience will see visions of the opportunities for change to make the world a better place. Old people who are tempted to believe that their time has passed, that their lives are effectively over, will dream dreams about what the chances are for them yet to do significant things in their life. That all who call on the name of the Lord will see this salvation. That's pretty amazing stuff. That's the kind of thing that any of us would certainly want, and not only that, but definitely need. Indeed, 3,000 people are going to be so captivated by that they sign on the dotted line for following Jesus and are baptized that day. That's a significant kind of experience. Well, we've been moving through the book of Philippians during this month of May. Philippians is written by a man named Paul. Paul was a person much like Peter in being just kind of bold and out there. In fact, his name was really Saul. Initially very much opposed to Christianity. He was responsible for the execution of many people who were following Jesus in those early days because he was convinced that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, till Jesus zaps him along the side of the road when he was making his way to Damascus one day and says, hey, quit persecuting me. And so Saul, who we really refer to as Paul, which means humble, which is kind of also funny, because Saul was anything but humble, and so God always kept reminding him that it was a humble journey to follow Jesus. So Paul gets that same kind of fervor for following Jesus that really has never been seen in any way up to now and probably never will be again with any kind of missionary fervor, the likes of which that Paul had. To now, not only as it was from this Pentecost day when it took the story of Jesus to the larger group of Jews throughout the world as it was, but now this very controversial movement of taking Jesus to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to everyone throughout the world that happens through the person of Paul. Paul was a Roman citizen. That was rather unique among those who were Israeli Jews, and that gave him a road into all sorts of different cultures, different communities, and it also gave him some status that protected him for quite some time. So Paul is writing to churches that he had founded throughout the region. And he had to write because he was often in prison for doing the Jesus work that he did. And that's an interesting irony that I like to point out, that if Paul hadn't been in prison, he would have gone physically to all of these churches, and obviously they would have just oral communication, and we wouldn't have really had any kind of historical evidence of what those conversations looked like. But because he was in prison, and certainly he would prefer not to have been in prison, we would have preferred for him that he wasn't in prison, but God works significantly through that for good, so that we now still have those words for these letters that he wrote to a particular context, a particular time, a certain church. But we can apply that all these years later into our own context. And as the book of Philippians, his letter to the people of Philippi, concludes, it's only 4 chapters. It says, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you, Rejoice always because God is near. So why, we sometimes have in our head, rejoice in the Lord always. Well, okay, fine. But why? Because God is near. So don't be defensive, but be gentle. Oh, okay. Not unlike what we saw from Peter when he was accosted. Don't worry about anything. Thankfully pray in the confidence of God's reality, and this will give you the kind of peace that humans can't even imagine. One of the most powerful paragraphs in the Bible about why it's a good idea to follow Jesus and how that impacts your daily life. That regardless of the circumstance, wherever you find yourself, you really can find joy. You can rejoice because you know that God is there. You know that God is doing something significant, even in the worst moments of your life. God promises to do good things with the people that he loves. Okay. And so therefore, you don't have to be defensive. You don't have to be in any way acerbic. You can be gentle because you know that God is there doing what God will do. And so you can even be a little humorous. You can be a little self-effacing. Whatever. Whatever helps you to engage the people that you are connected with. So that you should thankfully pray, being secure in the knowledge of God bringing about good things. In this month of Mother's Day, we have been talking about those things that we consider stereotypically feminine. And so on the one hand, we really couch it in the terms of what it is to be a mother, and then say, well, but it really is what it is to be a woman in general, and not only that, but even for men as well, that both genders are called to experience and to give evidence to those things that are stereotypically of the other gender. And so for men as well, this feminine piece. And we see this now before us in the life of Jesus in significant kinds of ways. God is usually referred to in male-type language in the Bible. But there are all sorts of ways in which God is experienced in a manner that we might refer to as more stereotypically feminine. That God is gentle and kind, slow to anger, has unconditional love. That you have Jesus who weeps for Lazarus, his buddy, who dies. And he weeps for the people of Jerusalem, wishing that they would have come to him and gathered around him like a chick does with the mother hen, finding protection under her wings. These and others are feminine kinds of qualities, and even now this ultimate call for us to be a part of imparting the spiritual journey to future generations is a feminine kind of thing. Men have run the church, if you like, virtually all the time throughout Christian history. But it's always been women that made sure the faith moved on to a new generation. And now in our time, when a lot of folks just don't really see the need for following Jesus in a focused, dramatic way that grabs hold of your life, well, there's a need for all of us, male and female, whether you're a mother or whether you're not a mother, whoever you might be, if you understand yourself to be a follower of Jesus, to grab a hold of this Pentecost understanding that whatever you're doing, normal kind of life, God is going to show up in the way that he did here at this Pentecost day. And he will give you the language that you need so that you'll be able to communicate. The people will be able to hear you, even though you might come from different backgrounds or different contexts of life, whatever that might be. Because we worry when confronted with that opportunity to share faith, to come alongside of people in a spiritual conversation. But to recognize that since God is there, we can rejoice always. We don't need to worry about anything. and that God will give us the words we need. God will help that person to hear whatever they need to hear for the purpose that all who call on the name of the Lord shall see this salvation. So in the week ahead, there are going to be people who you encounter, probably significant multiples, who really need to hear about that Jesus story. And if you jump out of your boat of life and take a risk, sometimes it will not be a pleasant experience. So don't get defensive. Be gentle. Throw in a little humor if you have it. Be confident that God will give you the language that you need, and that whatever isn't quite right, well, somehow or another, His Spirit will speak so they understand. Who are those people that you are aware of in your life? And look for them in this week ahead. Who need that hope that is only found in Jesus, the one who is the Prince of Peace, the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, the name upon which we call. And when we do, all shall be saved.